Everyone, welcome to the weekly seminar series. Where should I be looking for the camera?
The camera.
Camera's over here. Welcome to the weekly seminar series for the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research. My name is Martin Bunch. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. Today I'm delighted to host Lina Brand Correa, who will lead today's seminar entitled Ecological Economics for Public and Planetary Health, Moving Beyond the Neoclassical Paradigm. Before we start the seminar, as is our usual practice, I'm going to begin by acknowledging the indigenous land that we are on. This is a hybrid event. Some guests are on different territories, so please take the time to give thanks and respect to the land on which you're currently living and working. Today, I am here, and we are here in Toronto on the York University campus. We're situated on the traditional territory known as Toronto and acknowledge the current treaty holders, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also acknowledge this as the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and Métis. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Lina Brand Correa is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York. She has an MSc in Ecological Economics from the University of Edinburgh, and she completed her PhD at the University of Leeds. Her dissertation was entitled Following the Golden Thread, Exploring the Energy Dependency of Economics and Human Wellbeing. Her research interests include the impact on energy systems on climate change, energy service requirements for the satisfaction of human needs, energy poverty, and the impact of provisioning systems on well-being. In today's seminar, Lina will highlight the contributions that ecological economics can make in public and planetary health. Scholars often discuss ways in which we can develop an economic system that benefits people and the planet. However, these discussions are often developed with the neoclassical economics paradigm, and direct engagement with heterodox economic schools of thought has been lacking. Lina will outline how ecological economics offers an opportunity to make the transition to an economic system that is designed to promote human and planetary health from the outset, rather than one where social and environmental externalities must be constantly corrected after the fact. For example, important ideas from ecological economics include the use of a multi-dimensional framework to evaluate economic and social performance, the prioritization of well-being and environmental goals in decision-making, policy design and evaluation that take complex relationships into account, and the role of provisioning services, the physical and social systems that link resource use to social outcomes in general. Ecological economics also proposes possible interventions at the national scale that could promote public health and align with the prioritization of social and ecological objectives, including universal basic income, poor services, and sovereign money creation. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Lina to our seminar this afternoon. Just a quick note that this will be a one-hour event that will end at about 2 p.m. We're going to follow the presentation, a 20-minute presentation with a question and discussion period, and I'll wrap up and conclude the seminar at about 1:55. So, welcome Lina, and over to you.
So, shall I share? I'll share the screen. Okay. Well, thank you, Martin, for the introduction, and thank you everyone here at Dahdaleh for the invitation. It's really nice to be here and see some people in person, and we'll see the people that are joining us online as well. So yeah, just to start, this presentation is based on a paper that we published earlier this year. You'll note it's not difficult to note the similarity in the title. The paper is a bit broader in scope than what I'm going to be talking about. So it refers to a bit more broader, different schools of economic thought. I'm focusing here only on ecological economics, so I'll invite you to go and read it if this kind of spikes your interest. Also, I think it's really important to say that this paper was completely a team effort. I got to appear there first by kind of the lack of the alphabet. I have to admit that when I was at school, I wasn't very much happy with this. When I got called first for assignments and stuff before my classmates called Zapata or Urrutia or whatever, right? But anyway, Yeah. Okay, but going back to the author team, it was comprised of 3 public health researchers. That's Anna, Petra, and Janis. Janis kind of started the ball rolling, and Anna kind of kept us on track. And then it also comprised 3 ecological economists. So that's Milena, Dan, and myself. So I urge you to look into their work also, which is very relevant and related. Okay, let's get into it. Why did we decide to write this paper? It basically came out of Yannick's frustration that his public health colleagues, despite all their best intents, did not have the conceptual or the theoretical tools to propose public health interventions that could actually try to tackle the social determinants of health, right? It's good at identifying them, but the discussion doesn't go deeper than sort of identifying and trying to understand the underlying mechanisms behind that. And also interventions that at the same time can protect the environment upon which we depend. So planetary health, as you will know very well, recognizes the interaction between human health and the health of the environment we live in. It recognizes the impact that human activities have on the environment, and in turn the detrimental effects that those impacts have on population health. And public health recognizes the effect of certain economic factors and policies on human health, particularly around inequalities, social determinants of health, the importance of social welfare systems. But like I was saying, generally the story kind of stops there. And of course this is a generalization, right? But in general there is no questioning on what are the underlying economic structures or drivers that lead to environmental degradation. And that those economic structures and drivers might well be driving negative population health outcomes as well. So this is where kind of heterodox economics can contribute. So the whole idea of this is to kind of invite colleagues in working in health topics to engage with heterodox economics, and in particular ecological economics. Also to acknowledge we learned a lot as well with collaborating with our public health colleagues. I think there's a lot of kind of a two-way learning that can happen there. So hang on a minute. So is there actually more than one understanding of the economy? Yes, there is. And there's a great deal of pluralism in economic thinking. But usually when you hear in the radio, when you hear how it's talked about, we always talk about the economy as if it is one thing and we know how it behaves and how it talks about it. Or we talk about economics and it's like we're discussing news articles or whatever. It's like, oh, economics 101, like there's just one thing. And that's just really not the case. So we talk about it as if it were this one big homogeneous thing. Economic orthodoxy is centered around the Neoclassical school of thought, which is just one of many. Its understanding of the world is broadly taught throughout economics departments all over the world, and also is the basis for policy design, decision making, and evaluation. So there's kind of a big domination of neoclassical economics thinking in academia and outside of it. I just wanted to highlight here a couple of resources that I think are very good. Exploring Economics gives you, which this image is taken from, so it gives you a taste of different schools of thought. It discusses the ontological, epistemological units of analysis, all sorts of things about all of these different schools of economic thought. So it's a great introduction to get you started. And rethinking economics was actually born out of the 2008 financial crisis. It was economic students being really frustrated at what they were being taught, again, under the classical economics paradigm, was not able to solve or to explain or to help them understand what had just happened, right? So it was a big demand from economics students for a more pluralist approach to economics in economics departments. The network is still active. They've published lots of, always published that book, and they keep publishing, and it's active as well as internationally. It has chapters all over the world. Okay, so focusing now on ecological economics specifically, and I apologize to the ecological economists around here. This will be very obvious to you already, but what is it that makes ecological economics different from neoclassical economics? And I think this graph, although it's very simple, captures very well that main difference. So for ecological economics, the main difference is that the economy is embedded within the environment and not the other way around. What does this imply? It implies that in an ecological economics view of the economy, energy and material flows, which is how we interact with the environment, are important for understanding how societies and economies work, as are other biophysical realities that necessarily affect us. In contrast, for neoclassical economists, everything around us is seen through an economic lens, which is why you see humanity or society and the environment embedded within the economy. So everything is seen through an economic lens. For example, climate change is just a huge market failure. We failed to put a correct price on carbon emissions. That's what it is. Biodiversity loss. Oh, it's just a tragedy of management, a common pooled resource where property rights are not well defined enough, and so on. Right? Everything is seen through this economic lens. And because public and planetary health don't necessarily go into questioning the mainstream view of the economy, then the proposed solutions to tackle population and planetary health are generally along the lines of this neoclassical economics underlying worldview. So, for instance, we need to internalize health externalities into our existing economic system, right? So things like, the issue with climate change is that we haven't valued the climate impacts on health outcomes properly. We just need to actually properly value what those impacts would be on health, and then we'll be able to propose policy solutions that would adequately address them, right? So what we're doing there is, again, putting the environment and society and the health impacts, we're putting them in the economy, right? So it's the underlying neoclassical worldview is there. Now let's look at one example that we discuss in the paper, and this is the role of economic growth for neoclassical economics. We'll look at this example in more detail for neoclassical economics initially, and then for ecological economics and the implications of that for public health. So, for neoclassical economics, the role of growth is seen as overwhelmingly good, but neoclassical economists seldomly look at social and environmental issues, and these are only of interest if they affect the economy. So remember the figure in the previous slide. We're interested about social and environmental issues only through this economic lens. So issues of inequality are rarely discussed, and analysis tends to focus on national averages, which of course hide the distributions. So we could provide kind of a more nuanced way of phrasing this rising tide lifts all boats to something like a rising tide lifts all yachts more than the small kind of dinghies. Also, it is unclear whether certain social advances are a consequence of economic growth or not. What if, for example, the life expectancy positive outcomes that we've seen are a coincidence with growing economic growth, not a direct consequence of it? So, very likely to be a consequence of many other factors, and there's more and more empirical evidence coming from the ecological economics literature, highlighting that it's access to different types of social provisioning systems that prioritize these kind of population level positive outcomes rather than economic growth itself that's driving these improvements. Neoclassical economists also say that we can make growth better. We'll just do inclusive growth. We'll just do green and sustainable growth. But there's a few problems with this. There's little evidence of decoupling. So decoupling is when one variable grows and the other one grows either at a smaller rate or decreases. So economic growth goes up, and greenhouse gas emissions grow at a slower rate, that's relative decoupling. Or economic growth goes up and greenhouse gas emissions go down, that's absolute decoupling. But there is little evidence for this. In fact, there was a recent systematic review conducted around this, and it shows that relative decoupling is the norm where it has happened. It's not happening nearly fast enough. Absolute decoupling, which is what we need to reach net zero, has seldomly happened, and when it happened, it was in countries that were growing at a very small rate, or indeed just remaining stable. So there's that to take into account. And then also, when thinking about economic growth and thinking about decoupling, usually it's linked to efficiency improvements, but there's little consideration of the rebound effect. That's when, we make an improvement in the efficiency of certain processes in the economy, but the savings that we make from that efficiency improvement end up being used in processes that end up producing more of what originally we saved. Usually we discuss this in terms of energy. So for example, you switch to LED lights at home, but then what you save in your utility bill, you end up spending in a bigger SUV, which ends up using more energy than you save from more efficient light bulbs in the first place. So anyway, this is what, but what are the, kind of more importantly, I guess, what are the underlying assumptions within neoclassical economics to state all of these things? One key one is that a free market leads to efficient allocation, and that is related to what's called Pareto efficiency, where it says that the market is an allocative allocation mechanism that will lead to making everyone better off, or at least no one worse off. So there's this kind of this underlying assumption that this is what would happen. And then one really important that I'm particularly interested in is the role of how do neoclassical economists understand well-being. And well-being is understood, comes from the hedonic well-being tradition, and it's understood as linked to utility. So we all have a utility function inside us. We're rational actors. We all have it inside us, and we know it perfectly. And in order to maximize our utility, we choose from a set of goods, and we maximize that utility. The only thing that limits, the level of utility we can achieve is our budget. So therefore, kind of the logical consequence of that is that in order for us to be better off, we need more income. Therefore, we need more GDP, right? It's sort of ingrained in the assumptions of neoclassical economics. And any limit on consumption or any limit on increases on GDP, because of these underlying assumptions, would be seen as limits to your well-being, and to welfare, and to all of this. And that makes it complicated in terms of sustainability, because if we keep growing at an exponential rate in a finite planet with finite resources, with little evidence for decoupling, with no consideration of the rebound effect, we're in deep trouble. So what does ecological economics have to say about this? It says, well, that GDP is a terrible indicator. When you use GDP to measure economic activity, you end up measuring things that are good and bad as well. So, for example, there's massive fires in BC. All the efforts to rebuild those houses are counted towards GDP, so they increase GDP. And it doesn't measure a bunch of things that are good for people. So things that are not usually part of economic activity that we do for each other anyway, those don't get measured. So when I go and help my neighbor to fix something in their house, that doesn't get measured by GDP, but surely that's something good for society and should be considered. So here, feminist economics and talking about the care economy and all of that has very important critiques to make there. So ecological economics proposes we move to more comprehensive and holistic measures, and try to focus on things that are actually important. So Catherine Trebeck, who was part of the Wellbeing Economic Alliance, she used to kind of joke saying, what if instead of measuring GDP, we measure the percentage of girls cycling to school as a measure of societal progress? That would say a lot about how our societies are working in terms of many things, right? Of course, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, right? This is not a serious proposal, but that's the sort of thing. Like, why are we measuring economic activity, and why are we making decisions based on that? Why do we see in all our news articles, particularly at the moment, is how much has the economy grown or not in the last quarter? Like, who actually cares? What does that tell us? It doesn't really tell us much at all. And then, importantly here, and I guess we can discuss these more in the discussion part. The underlying assumptions are completely different. So ecological economics says people are not rational actors. We don't make decisions based on a utility function, and the way kind of to achieve well-being is not only through utility maximization. Also, the market is not the only resource allocation mechanism. We also have commons. We have depending on the types of goods, different allocation mechanisms will be better. So perhaps the state should intervene when we're talking about public goods. Perhaps there should be some common pool resource management type things for other types of goods. Not everything is well managed by the market. Also, ecological economics says that efficient allocation is not the only thing economics should be concerned about. They should also be concerned about fair distribution and sustainable scale. And then, again, like I said, my work focuses more on moving from the well-being side of stuff, moving from preferences to needs. So what if we prioritize differently in society, focus on needs rather than on preferences? Perhaps we could go from a situation where we go from a pursuit of infinite growth to a pursuit of sufficiency. Anyway, so just to finish up, the implications for public health are, I guess, quite straightforward from what I've said, but I think also open a lot of possibilities. The implications are basically that we can reorganize our societies so that our provisioning systems are geared towards the fulfillment of needs as opposed to preference satisfaction, and therefore well-being for all can be achieved with reduced consumption and staying within environmental limits. So these are a couple of studies that have empirically kind of tested this precisely. And with enough redistribution and focusing on other things rather than maximizing GDP, we can achieve these things. And of course, when these studies are thinking about need satisfaction, health is a key component there, right? It's central. So I just want to read a quote very quickly to finish here from that first paper there on the left. It says, which I think is quite funny, but kind of again linking back to what do I mean by well-being. And so the current work offers a response to the cliched populist objection that environmentalists are proposing that we return to living in caves. With tongue firmly in cheek, the response roughly goes, yes, perhaps, but these caves have highly efficient facilities for cooking, storing food and washing clothes, low energy lighting throughout, 50 liters of clean water supplied per day per person, with 15 liters heated to a comfortable bathing temperature. They maintain an air temperature of around 20 degrees throughout the year, irrespective of geography, have a computer with access to global ICT networks, a link to extensive transport networks providing 5,000 to 15,000 kilometers of mobility per person each year via various modes, and are also served by substantially larger caves where universal healthcare is available, and others that provide education for everyone between 5 and 19 years old. And at the same time, it is possible that the amount of people's lives that must be spent working would be substantially reduced. So okay, there are ways that we can do this, and perhaps thinking about things like degrowth, thinking about sustainable scale, thinking about prioritizing things differently wouldn't involve a massive step backwards. In case it would perhaps involve living in kind of cool caves. Anyway, and just kind of what I guess David Graeber would say, kind of what I'm trying to say here is basically inviting kind of health colleagues to question neoclassical economics assumptions when they see them. These are just all assumptions, and it's just the way we have made the world. But we can make it differently, right? Okay, I just had here, but I know I've run out of time, but some possible interventions, and kind of these are interventions that are usually proposed within ecological economics, and those are kind of that's the evidence in relation to public health. How would they contribute? But yeah, and then these are just kind of some initiatives to look out for. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance, I think it's really interesting. They've got a Canada chapter now, and then there's the Donut Economics by Kate Mayworth, and they've got a Donut Economics Action Lab doing all sorts of things to actually implement these things on the ground with people in different cities and regions and so on. And the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is working with governments around the world, again, to try and prioritize things differently in our economy. So they've got the government of Scotland, Finland, New Zealand, Wales, all on board doing things kind of in this line. Not completely, but they're going in that direction. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone over my time, but thank you very much, and I look forward to this discussion.
Well, thank you, Lina. I'm going to open up the floor, both people that are here in person and online. I will just ask that if you're online, you use the little tool that will allow you to put up a hand to show that you want to ask a question. And when I call on you, please just shortly introduce yourself. Just say your name and potentially who or where you are. Would anybody like to start?
I've got one. Thanks so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I was just curious about, you mentioned kind of how a lot of planetary health and I guess also population health interventions are informed by that neoclassical perspective, like things like carbon taxes and more the public health space. You've also got like soda taxes, and people have talked about red meat taxes and approaches like that. And I think you had a slide really briefly at the end about interventions that would be more informed by that ecological perspective, but I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, talk about how they might be a bit different from the neoclassical informed ones, because I thought that, you know, the vision is very appealing, but the kind of how do you get there and how do you like move the population in that direction, I was curious about.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good question, and of course the devil is always on the detail on how to. So there's been, you know, lots of proposals of policy interventions from an ecological economics perspective, and I guess, you know, there is a lot more of engagement to do with the health space. But I think the basic difference that I would find is in what is the criteria used to make decisions when it comes to making decisions that are informed by an ecological economics view of the world or a neoclassical economics view of the world. So one thing that is that, you know, keeps happening, you know, when you talk to people that work on policy kind of on the implementation side is, for example, the prevalence or of cost-benefit analysis to make a decision, right? So you've got a bunch of options and you do a cost-benefit analysis, and the one that comes up with a better cost-benefit ratio is the one that gets done. But that implies that we have to put everything within the economy, right? Going back to this sort of thing. So we end up doing these mental gymnastics, and of course there's a lot of methods that have gone into this, a lot of methodological improvements gone into this, and they're becoming better and better. But ultimately what we're doing is, again, putting everything within the economy bubble. Ecological economics, for instance, proposes, okay, there's different ways of making decisions. Perhaps instead of using that, we can use multi-criteria decision-making, where there's different criteria. Not everything is put in monetary terms, and therefore we can try and make decisions in a different way. So rather than discussing kind of specific policies, it's more about, I think, well, to me, the most important difference is, okay, how do we actually make decisions, and what is it that we're prioritizing when we make those decisions? There's a question online too, I don't know.
There's a question online, we'll go back and forth. So, Jim Stint.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a great presentation, really clear, and yeah, just a breath of fresh air to hear a really clear presentation talking about non-market alternatives to planetary health and climate change. So thank you very much for that. I think my question was, similar to the last question, actually. I was just curious about how we actually move to a place where like market mechanisms are not the dominant solution that people are proposing to things like climate change or planetary health, and people are actually, at high levels of policy, actually considering some of these other potentially non-market approaches, or even like thinking about degrowth as a serious possibility. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, great. Yeah, I think that is a really good question, and it's not an easy one, of course, because again, kind of going back to what I was mentioning at the beginning, there is this whole dominance of neoclassical economics in economics departments and outside of them. So it's not easy, but you can see sort of glimpses of change happening. So, for example, as I mentioned in the Wellbeing Economic Alliances, they've got the Wellbeing Economy Government. So, a couple of cases to highlight there that I think are particularly interesting is, for example, in the case of Wales, they've implemented a youth council or something like that. Oh no, Future Generations Council or something like that. So every policy decision that is made in Wales needs to pass a certain set of criteria established by the Future Generations Council. So basically, every decision that they're making needs to consider the impact that it will have on future generations. And that trumps any sort of cost-benefit analysis of market mechanism, right? So there are different ways of implementing this. So I think that's a really interesting case. I haven't looked into detail at what things, I think certain things have been blocked because of that. I think, for example, plans for airport expansion recently, I think, I might be wrong, but I think I read something about that being blocked because of the impact on future generations. That's, of course, trumping a very positive cost-benefit analysis for an airport expansion. So that's one example that I think is interesting. The other one is in New Zealand, they established a couple of years ago the well-being budget. And again, of course, GDP was still there as one of the budget lines and one of the goals of things to increase, but it had all sorts of other things as well, and lots of health-specific related stuff, taking into account, again, differences, right? When we talk about fair distribution and of course the indigenous populations in New Zealand, it had specific lines there addressing these things, which is very different from what you would see in other kind of more traditional high level policy things. So yeah, I don't know if those two examples help, but yeah, that's the sort of thing that where I see kind of these things happening.
Awesome, thank you. We had another question first over here.
Sorry, I'll be brief, hopefully. Yes, so similar vein. I'm Hillary, PhD student in environmental and urban studies, faculty of environmental change. Sorry, with Roger. Have to sell it well. So similar question in terms of taxation, and as I was listening to you, I was thinking kind of selfishly about what I'm working on myself. I'm in my comprehensive stage of my program, so I'm reading a lot about urban water and sanitation management in global south cities, and the kind of market logic of extending services to certain communities versus not, and this cost-benefit analysis and the role of the private sector in it. And these are cities that don't already have services. So the question of degrowth is a different question than, say, in the context of the global north. And a lot of the arguments that I'm reading, at least at this stage, are, there's an inefficiency in the private sector in terms of delivering services given the externalities. So there is a need for a solid tax base, but the tax base doesn't exist. So there's need for growth.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, listening to this is fascinating because it brings out all of those points from an economic perspective in a way that I haven't read it. So I'm wondering, I don't have a question, but I just want to pose that as like a different example, and if that sparks anything for you.
No, and I think that's a really important point to bring up, because usually when we talk about these arguments around perhaps degrowth or post-growth or whatever, there's always the question of, okay, but what about the global south countries which haven't reached this? And I think, degrowth is not proposing that global south countries should degrow. Of course, there needs to be a level of growth to achieve certain things. But I think what ecological economics would say, not all of them, but is perhaps we just need to be agnostic about growth. Like, let's prioritize achieving water sanitation. If that involves economic growth, okay. If it doesn't, that's okay as well. Okay. Having said that, I think the case that you say about water and sanitation is really interesting, because ecological economics would divide goods depending on different characteristics. And this is very much based on the work of Herman Daly, who sadly passed away, I think a week or two ago, something like that. And so you can divide goods depending on whether they are rival and excludable, and depending on that, then different allocation mechanisms would be relevant, right? Like I was saying. So for goods that are non-rival and non-excludable, and this is the case for most of environmental goods, and this relates to water to an extent, depending on the circumstance, then the market is not a good way of doing it. So in the case of water, and I understand the limitations of the state to go in and act as a natural monopoly to provide these sorts of things. But in that case, there's other things, and for example, the work of it comes to mind like the work of help me out here, Commons Nobel Prize winner Ostrom. Yeah. Yes. I think that would be super interesting, right? And in fact, doing field work around energy, I worked with a community in Medellin, in my home city, that exactly were having problems around this, right? They weren't getting the water supplies through the utility company, so they were just going forwards and setting their own community-run water thing. And then maybe this is a different way of managing commons that goes past the market, but it also goes past the state being the mediator of this, and and it's kind of thinking about these different ways of doing allocation of resources. I don't know how much that helps, but that's what comes to mind with from what you said.
Yeah, I'll want to pick your brain more later, but that was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Just before we go back to the question over here, I just want to check with the online participants. Any questions from there first? Not right now, so okay, here's another hand that was up here.
Great, thank you so much, because you asked one of the questions I had.
Okay.
So I can focus on the second one.
Okay.
So my name is Jean-Jacques. I'm with a new project, AI for Preparedness, Pandemic Preparedness, and we're really focused on Global South. That's why I really appreciate your question. So let me just ask you, so I worked in the Ontario government as an economic policy person for many years. So neoclassical economics hasn't stood still, right? And I think it still provides a great analytical framework to discuss these issues. And I guess it's more of a positioning question that I have, because I think I would learn so much from taking some of your classes here. But how might we position this change of emphasis that we're looking for? Because I certainly see myself, I recognize myself in what you're saying. But I wonder whether public policy, so I see the broader categories of public policy. The public policy, you will be happy to hear, doesn't follow economic advice solely. Economists are just an advisory. They're just advisors. And there's a range of advisory kind of groups, right? That's how we did it when I was in the Ontario government. And I think that's the right way to do it. And so how would you position ecological economics in contrast to neoclassical that hasn't stood still? Like all the analytical language that you're using is, I think, neoclassical, right? And the change is really more one of emphasis. And we do get this advice from different groups as well. So I know I'm pushing a bit, but it's really because I want to understand. And I know you didn't have a lot of time to expand, right?
No, and that's a great question. And of course, public policy doesn't just go and ask the economists what would you do and then do it, right? There's a lot of negotiation. There'll be other people advising with different expertise, and they'll come to a decision, and then I guess what ecological economics can provide, in contrast to neoclassical economists, is doing different types of analysis and providing different types of advice. Again, perhaps embedding these different prioritizations within the economic analysis already, rather than relying on highlighting other important issues from other people that are advising towards a particular decision. So like I said, just kind of the example that comes to mind is the multi-criteria analysis, right? When when the economic advice is being provided, so it's not like, I don't know how to put it. So it's not like the economic analysis is pushing some things here, and then the public health people are pushing another thing, and then the other, I don't know, the old age advocates or whatever are pushing for this other thing, and everyone's pushing, and let's see who wins, and let's see who wins in inverted commas and stuff. What I think ecological economics could contribute is, already within the economic analysis, we're considering other things. It's already kind of a broader broader type of analysis that includes other important factors. I don't know, does that?
No, that helps a lot. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it helps provide a broader frame that's consistent, right? Because of course what happens otherwise is you do get a bit of a horse trading, right? And they don't necessarily speak to each other.
Yeah.
At least that was my experience in public policy.
Exactly. But policy, kind of just to follow on from that, I think policy is really difficult, because the other thing is that we tend to think that policy is done as a evidence-based policy making, right? And that, when policy is done, you get all of these advice, people will weigh the evidence and will get to the right decision, but it's really not like that. So usually what happens is the opposite. You do policy-based evidence making, right? You want a policy, and the evidence you'll get somehow, right? But the way I would position ecological economics in being able to contribute to that is to, I don't know, perhaps, I don't know if it's the right way of putting it, but perhaps making it a little bit more difficult to be able to put the types of kind of market-based solutions all the time, to make it a little bit more difficult to do the policy-based evidence making of that. Do you see what I mean? Anyway, that's
it's
how
very useful. It's very useful. I'd love to continue that on, but thank you. That's awesome.
Just a quick question. There.
Just 1 second, just check with our online participants.
Eric's there.
No? Okay.
Very quick question. Thank you. We talked about this earlier as well, so I was looking forward to this. In terms of effectiveness, provided, considering you'll get resistance of all sorts of things, acceptability, at what scale, you talked about community level, you talked about policy level, at what level or what scale do you see ecological economics to be the most effective framework to change, to make it, to push that change that's needed, considering we don't have so much time, planet's already burning.
Yeah.
How exactly do you shift?
Yeah, well, I don't know. That's a really, really tough question. I think there's people working on trying to embed these ideas at all different levels. So like I mentioned, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is working with national governments, trying to embed this. The Donut Economics Action Lab is working with lots of cities and municipalities on kind of a smaller level. Other people and kind of my own work in relation to energy and well-being and trying to understand that has been much more at the community level. So I think you probably need that sort of, lots of people working at all sorts of different levels. What I find kind of compelling about this and kind of useful is that, talking about well-being is it's very difficult to argue against it, even politically, right? It's very, very difficult, or for a community member or for a mayor or whatever to say, no, I'm against well-being, or I'm against it's very difficult. And again, it's something that's why I think it's important to kind of have a think about these things in the context of health as well, because I think the health angle is very powerful as well politically, precisely because it's very difficult to. It's just a no-goer. Who's going to say I'm against improving people's health, right? And it was a very, very, very powerful argument to make, right? So that's a bit of a dodging your question, but I think it needs to be at all levels. But I do find that this lens of focusing on well-being and thinking about well-being beyond consumption is important. I think that's one key thing that ecological economics contributes to as well. Also separating means and ends. So if the ends are to be well and all of these things, and the means are different, the means can include some sort of consumption, but the means can be all sorts of different things. Whilst neoclassical ecological economists would say neoclassical economists confuse this, and for neoclassical economists, the end is the mean, not the. The end is the consumption and stuff, and that's just the means to achieve certain things. Anyway, so yeah, separating these things between means and ends, and trying to understand well-being in a different way, I think is quite key and perhaps compelling politically.
We all need to read Bhutan's Happiness Index report.
Well, Bhutan is an interesting place, and I'm glad you brought it up because this is another question that comes up when discussing well-being as well a lot. Who gets to define what are the categories of well-being and what are the needs or whatever? And because this is a common criticism, like, oh, you can't say that this is what we need. That's very paternalistic and all of that. And in the case of Bhutan, it's interesting because it was a certain group of people who put the Bhutan index. And in general, that index is great. Most of it's kind of, I think it's 8 categories are great, but one of them talks about preserving cultural sensitivities or something like that, or I don't know, preserving the culture of Bhutan. But of course, this was defined by a particular group in Bhutan, and then it ended up affecting another ethnic group within that, being quite discriminatory, right? So those questions are important as well. So within ecological economics, usually the establishment of what is it exactly that a community needs, it's considered more as a participatory process, right? Not defined, not imposed from other people, certainly not imposed from the north to the south. So there's that whole debate there as well. But yeah.
Okay, thanks. We have another question online. Ben, again.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Lina. It was an awesome seminar. I just had a question about, just well-being in general, and just the, I guess, perspective of neoclassical economics. Like, to me, sometimes it feels like in, the current economics model that we have, everything seems reactionary, as in we don't try to prevent things. It's rather we let things happen and then we try to fix things, especially when it comes to health. Not sure if I don't understand it, so I was wondering if there's a reason for it for neoclassical economics to look at it that way, And what would that alternatively look like in ecological economics? Like, does it actually change to prevention, or does it still going to be reactionary? Yeah, I was wondering if you have comments about that. Thank you.
Great. No, thanks, Ed. Yeah, it's that's a really good question. And I think we say in the paper that the ecological economics view would be more in line with a more preventative health approach, precisely because you are not assuming from the beginning that markets will work and that will allocate resources efficiently and then things will happen. On the contrary, your objective is positive outcomes from the beginning, focusing on needs rather than on wants, blah, blah, blah. So in the paper, we say that it is compatible with this, that ecological economics would perhaps, ecological economic approaches would perhaps lead to preventative approaches in health. Would that be the case in reality, in practice? I don't know. But we sort of, we fantasize that would be the case. But yeah.
Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I have another question, but I've already asked one, so I can.
Go ahead.
Okay. Kind of falling out of that question, potentially about prevention and different kind of understandings of what makes a healthy person and a healthy body. I'm wondering about waste, pollution, waste, these externalities that are trying to, as you discussed in the neoclassical model, are trying to be incorporated into the economy, but are actually kind of frame the economy more generally. It's kind of the economy within the waste. Yeah, waste. I think that's when we think about air pollution or CO2 emissions or kind of the opposite end of growth, right? And how, if you could say a bit more about that within the framework of ecological economics, and what, if there's a particularly pertinent way of thinking about waste differently within that model than.
Yeah. So a couple of things. It's absolutely true that within the neoclassical economics model, because everything is within the economy, and the economy has a circular way of, that's not considered. Ecological economics considers the flows of energy and materials, and therefore the flows of waste as well. Okay, so that's just kind of from the vision of the economy and how that's considered or not. Now, neoclassical economists would say, and this is talking about the environmental Kuznets curve, and when we're talking about pollution, waste, even CO2 emissions, what you have to do, what happens is, as your income goes up, these things go up to a certain point. You get to a point where you reach a certain level of income, and these kind of negative environmental impacts go down. Now, there is evidence that that is the case for very localized type impact. So, for example, when you talk about sanitation, water and stuff, right? You need a certain level of income to be able to build the sewers. Once you've got the sewers, there's improved. So, because we've seen this in very localized type things, then the argument from neoclassical economics is we just need to keep growing our way out of environmental issues, including pollution. However, there is no evidence of an environmental Kuznets curve for more sort of global issues, for example, CO2 emissions, right? And this is related to the issue of is there actually evidence of decoupling these things, right? So that's sort of one thing. And then the other thing that, and I think this is proposed particularly by Kate Raworth on her donut economics, is, okay, let's try not to think about this, that we'll grow our way out of these issues, but maybe can we be regenerative by design? Try and include some, a little bit of circularity within this, acknowledging that there are certain thermodynamic realities that mean we can't possibly have a fully circular economy, but, can we try and, by design, be a bit more regenerative rather than thinking we just need to keep increasing our income enough up to a point where we can deal with the waste or with the, negative environmental impacts that we're having. So,
right. So yeah, kind of this circular economy to an extent that is more ecological than just kind of recovering costs or
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
There's,
Well, I think we're at time now, so I'm gonna have to stop the questions at this point. But I did want to thank our speaker today. I really found that this was a very compelling topic. It's something that I thought about a little bit as well. And as you know, I appreciate the review of the worldview of neoclassical economics. And there are certain points in your discussion where for me, they really resonate. And so, for example, this example from Wales, where they have a mechanism that actually can incorporate longer-term thinking rather than the 4-year cycle that we usually find our political decision makers kind of trapped within. And you mentioned the regenerative aspect. So regenerative sustainability is an idea that I think is really, it's got legs that can carry us forward in terms of trying to build this ecological economic understanding into our decision making. So yeah, thank you very, very much, and thanks for your response to all the questions as well. And I'd just like to invite our participants to give a round of appreciation to Lina. Thank you all, and you're all now on our list, so you'll hear about our next, our next presentation.